to this computer. Okay, welcome to our first pain seminar. We are coming to you from Grace Midcity, and I am Claire Cantro, and I'm here with Amy Aucoin, who will be sort of manning our pain support group in person as this kind of continues to phase and move into the next phases and stuff. What we were hoping to do, and what I've done with sort of a presentation that I've given many times and to many different types of people, both clinicians, both patients in pain, layperson, anyone who will listen generally, is that I took that big presentation and sort of broke it up into four different parts that are a little bit more manageable and sort of as a way to introduce some discussion in our support groups. So we are recording this and we're going to try to maybe share it via the Grace YouTube or my own personal YouTube or whatnot, but to try to drum up some interest and see what we have to offer through these pain seminars and these discussions. So the other thing that I will say is I'll be kind of checking the chat to see if there's anybody who has questions. But I also have someone in person here too. And if she has any specific questions, then I will make sure that we say those out loud and repeat them. That way we can kind of have a little bit of a discussion. So here is Pain Science 101. Why do I hurt? Well, let's see if I can get it moving here. There we go. Okay, so this is what I look like on picture day. But for the most part, I look way more tired. The hair's generally in a ponytail. This is my very boring background. The biggest take-home message here is that I was a physical therapist. I went to physical therapy school because I was an athlete. Thought I kind of wanted to work with athletes. Realized that that was a patient population that was very well spoken for. And then right off the bat, I found a connection that through my sort of gifted hands and as a manual therapist and the understanding that most of the time patients are walking in the clinic to see us because they're in pain and they want to get out of pain and they want to feel better. So I kind of immersed myself in pain science. I felt like if it didn't really matter what type of manual therapy I practiced, as long as I understood pain and as long as I could teach patients about what they were feeling. And I didn't really know right at the time when I was kind of first getting into this, but there were scientists and critical thinkers way smarter than me that were already making the distinction that when people better understood their pain experience got way better. So all of the factors that we look at when we talk about pain, not just the physical symptoms that we want to get rid of, but all of the things that go with that, the mental and emotional stressors, the anxiety, the depression, the lack of sleep, the comorbidities with other chronic diseases and stuff like that. And all of those factors get a little bit better when you understand your pain experience better. So that's why we're here today. That's why we're introducing these pain support groups with a little bit of background knowledge on pain science. Explain Pain is a book written by Lorimer Moseley and David Butler. And these two individuals are probably my favorite of the pain gurus. But what I love about this quote and what they believe is that any single person, people without a degree in neuroscience, people without any sort of health professions background, can understand pain. And when they do, it lessens the threat to them. Okay, so this is the physiology of pain can be easily understood by men and women in the street. And understanding pain physiology changes the way people think about pain, reduces its threat value, and improves the management of it. So that's what we're hoping to do today. When you really understand your pain, so I'm not someone who most of my research as a clinician comes in the form of patient experiences, and I work on someone and this worked, then I do it again. If I work on someone and it didn't work, I don't do it again. So I'm not necessarily a research scientist, but I can understand that in the medical model and in healthcare today, evidence is really important. So this is a list of all of the very high level evidence that shows just how much pain, neuroscience education, PNE, or explain pain, or whatever you think of, is that when a patient is educated in their pain experience, your quality of life improves, your sleep improves, your full-time work increases, means you make money, your worry, your anxiety, your depression, all of those factors decrease. The amount of expenses that you spend on the medical model and the medical system goes down considerably, and your actual subjective complaints of pain decrease. So this is super important. It's necessary that we start having these conversations. So overall, over the next 4 weeks, this is what we will be covering. Today, specifically, we're going to kind of dive into the neuroscience of kind of an introduction or a reminder of what your nervous system does and why it's there. And then something called sensory processing, and that is how we navigate our environment. That is how we thrive. That's how we respond to things in our world. That's how when we walk outside and it's a little bit cooler, we walk right back in and go get a jacket. Or so that's maybe a volitional action that we do. Or our autonomic nervous system generates automatic responses that raise our core temperature to keep us a little bit more comfortable. So sensory processing is sort of the basis for everything that I teach in terms of pain science, in terms of stress management, in terms of trauma recovery, what the nervous system and body does in response to trauma. It is sort of the common denominator in all of these topics that have this really common thread. And it all goes back to, is my nervous system safe and regulated? So when it comes to any sort of profound change, if we are overly stressed and we want to be less stressed, if we're in a significant amount of pain and we want to be in less pain, if we want to be a better human that is better capable of engaging with other people, learning, connecting, all of those really profound things that make us human and make us well connected to other humans, and that is a regulated nervous system. Now, let's keep in mind that the goal of a regulated nervous system is not to be calm all the time. That we as humans are designed to respond internally to a perceived threat in our environment. And once that threat is removed, then we come back to baseline, right? So it's not about we're constantly calm. It's not about we're constantly reactive, or even that we're constantly in this low place, or a lot of highs, a lot of lows. It's the fact that we can get ourselves back down to a nice, regulated, safe nervous system. Okay. So that's the goal. How do we do that? Well, a nervous system needs safety, right? So when we look at children who, have high ACEs scores, or a lot of trauma history, or don't feel safe with their loved ones who should be taking care of them, these are the children who end up with a prolonged, overly active nervous system. So think about that when it comes to nervous system regulation, and the number one thing is safety, recognizing the things in your life that create safety for you. The things in your life that do not create safety for you should be eliminated, right? That's a hard concept because some of those things are important people in our life, our jobs, our different things. But the most important thing is safety, right? The second is connection. So when we are regulated in our nervous system, we want to socially engage with others. We want to connect with others. We're not reactive. We can have conversations and we can have disagreements, and we cannot have that affect us negatively and want to send us into a triggered tailspin. The other thing we need is activation. So when it comes to, myself as a physical therapist, our biggest tool often is movement, right? Exercise, movement, all of those things. Our nervous system has to move to be well. Now, if you're someone who is in pain, sometimes that's a really hard pill to swallow. So the key is to find ways that you can activate your body and activate your nervous system. Sorry, I keep standing in front of it, in ways that are super beneficial. So as a clinician who sees a lot of chronic pain or a lot of central sensitization, the thing that I do mostly is not what you typically see in a PT clinic where you have exercise bands and weight racks and all of those things. I am doing exercises that target calming your nervous system. A lot of balance training, a lot of flooding the nervous system with good, calm, positive input. That still can mean activation. So one thing that I use a lot is a vibration plate. So a vibration plate is very good because it activates your vagus nerve, which is our most important nerve to calm our nervous system down. But it's a stimulus, right? It's not something that we go and lay down and meditate and we're quiet and all of that, which is also very important. It's our last thing to have a regulated nervous system or to feel safe and in our body is adequate rest, right? Of course, if you're someone who has been in pain for a very long time and your cortisol levels are constantly through the roof, it's sometimes very hard to get adequate sleep. So what I can say is that if we can approach the nervous system from all four of those different components, all of them start benefiting each other a little bit. Okay. So here's a quick overview of our nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two basic parts, right? Our central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and our peripheral nervous system is anything outside of the brain and spinal cord. So all the nerves that go down into our extremities, the cranial nerves that come off of our brain, these are the nerves that carry messages to and from different parts of our body, right? And the peripheral nervous system itself is actually divided into its own, technically, it's three different systems, but we know the ones that we know and think of often are the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And those two work in opposition of each other. They also are important in our world, right? So the sympathetic nervous system gets a little bit of a bad rap because it's that constantly stressed out, fight or flight, ready to be triggered and reactive. And then the parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest, it's our place of healing, our place of calm. But we as humans have to have both of these systems well and active. The key is that we cannot exist in a constant state of that sympathetic fight or flight overdrive. That's where we end up in chronic pain. That's where we end up in chronic anxiety, chronic stress, and all of those things kind of play off of each other hand in hand. So a little unpacking of that autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic fight or flight and the parasympathetic rest and digest. So we just kind of talked a little bit about that. And I think on the next slide, yes. So the most important nerve in our body resides in the parasympathetic nervous system. It's one of the cranial nerves. In fact, it's cranial nerve 10, and it's called the vagus nerve. And I love this picture of the vagus nerve because it is just an extremely powerful, beautiful image of just how much this nerve can accomplish. It's often called, it's like the largest nerve in the body. It's often called the wandering nerve because it just comes out and it goes a little bit into the neck. It goes a little bit into the thoracic cavity. It pierces through the diaphragm and it gets into our internal organs and stuff. So the other thing is, if you've ever heard of that term, the gut-brain connection, it comes from the vagus nerve, also the enteric nervous system, which envelops all of the gut. But this is the most important nerve. This is the nerve that is going to create autonomic functions that we need to help us stay alive and thrive and all of that stuff. The key is with any pain management, with any stress management and self-care, it all goes back to the vagus nerve and how we can the things that we can do to stimulate or activate the vagus nerve, which pulls us from a very sympathetic fight or flight, triggered by everything, reactive, ready to respond, back into our bodies and to a place of safety, connection, and social engagement. So when it comes to the nervous system, the absolute most basic goal is always safety and survival. Now, many, many years ago, that was me fighting off a saber-toothed tiger, right? To stay alive, to continue to procreate, or, in where we live today, the survival is, I got to meet this deadline. I had a fight with my spouse and I'm reeling about it. So the safety and survival looks quite a bit different as we've evolved as humans, but that is still the most important thing. So when we start unpacking the many layers of nervous system regulation and sensory processing, and specifically pain, keep in mind that whenever your body receives some message from the environment, whether it's the external environment or something inside of our body, the number one thing the brain says is, how do I go back? How do I achieve safety and survival in this potentially threatening situation? So we'll unpack a little bit more of that. We're going to talk about the evolution of the brain in specific parts. So the most basic, the original brain that we all have, that reptiles have, that mammals have, is what we call the lizard brain, and it's the brainstem and cerebellum. It's all of our automatic responses. It's the seat of the fight or flight response. The cerebellum is also important in lots of balance and balance and upright posturing and stuff. But when we talk about this lizard brain, this is the one that activates right off the bat when we feel something in our environment is threatening. That's not to say that something in our environment is actually threatening, but if our brain perceives, hey, have we been here before? No, we haven't. This could be bad. Or if our brain perceives, we have been here before, and yes, it's a threat, we're going to elicit a protective response, right? You've come into contact with a lizard, the tail falls off, it outpouches that big pink thing from its neck, or frogs that emit some toxic chemical from its skin when it feels threatened or attacked. So those are some of those examples. The question that the reptilian brain always asks is, am I safe? And generally, it doesn't think that it is. The mammalian brain is evolutionary to include now what we consider the limbic system, right? So the amygdala, the thalamus, all of the parts of the brain that operate with emotions and memories and connections to other things in our environment, to other animals, all of those things. The mammalian brain's question is, am I loved? It also goes back to, am I safe here, right? So I always use the example of my dog Oakley, who, if I walk into the house and he has gotten into the garbage or he has feasted on cat turds, he gives me his shame face. And I know this right off the bat. I know he did something wrong because the moment I walk in, he's hanging his head low, his eyes are sort of closed. It is that typical dog shame face, right? Now, what's beautiful about the mammalian brain and dogs and the difference between mammals and humans is that the moment I start talking to him in a sweet little voice and tell him what a good boy he is, he completely snaps out of his shame response and he's back in. So that's the sort of important distinction between other mammals and humans, is that humans, we can ruminate on things that have happened to us in the past. So we can have an actual stress response and experience just by thinking of something that was stressful to us in the past, right? So the final evolution of our brain is the human brain, or the neocortex. This is our language, our abstract thinking, our ability to communicate with other people and connect with other people. It's our ability to remember shit that we need to forget, and still have some nervous system response to that, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sensory processing. So I mentioned at the start that this is the basis of human experience, right? Everything about how we navigate our world goes back to sensory processing. This idea that we take information in from our environment, that is both external environment and internal environment, and that message is carried through our peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, then up to the brain. And the brain decides, have we been here before? Is this important? Is this threatening? And then it produces some output or response, right? So sometimes a sensory message can come in and it's not threatening at all. So I gave the example of you walk outside and you're like, oh, it's a little chillier than I thought it was. So I turn right back in and I go get a jacket or, those sort of things. That's not a threat response. That's just a, hey, I've adapted well over time. I now am someone who can buy a sweater and put it on. But when it comes to significant stress disorders and trauma, when it comes to pain, what ends up happening is that sensory message that comes into the system is perceived by the brain as a major threat. And so what then happens is it elicits a multi-system response and we feel pain, right? So there's a lot of things that come into play in our experience of pain. But the number one thing and the number one take home message is that if the brain does not recognize whatever that sensory input as a threat, you won't feel pain. So that's a hard concept. And in the next seminars, we will kind of discuss these particular things. But I want to unpack that for a minute to think of there are instances where we have significant tissue damage in our body and we don't feel pain, right? So like some examples are, the soldier that steps on a bomb and gets his limb blown off, but is able to crawl to safety, right? And he goes back and says, I didn't even feel that. I didn't even know that my limb was not there until now we're in safety. We wake up and now we don't see our limb, right? And the reason something like that happens is that in that moment, if we go back to the most important goal of the brain is safety and survival, it's not important for us to writhe around in pain in that moment. What's most important is that we get ourselves to safety, right? So on the other side of things, when we look at chronic pain, when we look at central sensitization, when we look at people who are suffering in pain, but they get images and everything looks normal. They don't have any tissue representation of damage, disorder, trauma of any kind, and yet they're in significant pain, right? And the difference between those two things is the brain's interpretation of that specific situation, right? And we'll talk more about how pain gets bigger and bigger and becomes more about sort of the central nervous system in the next seminars. But this is what sensory processing looks like. So let's go to the most basic aspect of sensory processing, and it's the fact that we have senses, right? We have sensory receptors all over our body. We have special senses like in our eyes, taste buds, nose. So the 5 senses that all of us have known and loved over time and learned is taste, smell, touch, hearing, and vision. The 3 that we often don't hear about and talk about, but often are the most important in my profession as a physical therapist, and specifically the ones that I go to most often with my patients, in chronic pain, is the vestibular system, which sits in our inner ear, and it's how we write ourselves in our environment. It's our head, the movement of our head on our body, and our ability to regulate that at any moment, right? If you're someone who has ever had any sort of vestibular dysfunction, it's rough, right? Proprioception is another sense that you don't really know exists until you have a problem with yours, right? So proprioception is our ability to know where our body is in space without having to think about it, right? It's the fact that I can go and walk and not have to look down at my feet. It's if I closed my eyes and Amy came and put my hand in a certain position, I could describe what my hand is doing, right? So it's sort of an intrinsic connection to the different parts of our body, without having to like look and see it, right? And it's very much linked to balance and that sort of system. What's interesting about proprioception, there's three areas in our body that are really loaded with proprioceptors, is our foot and ankle, our sacroiliac joints or our SI joints, and our cervical spine. Those are the three areas that when they are damaged, they're sometimes the hardest to recover from. These are the patients, they're like, oh, I had a horrible ankle sprain however long ago. And those people continue to sprain their ankles throughout their life, right? It's like every time they step, they're rolling again because they've lost that intrinsic ability to know where their foot is supposed to contact, right? Same with people who have like SI joint trauma or SI joint dysfunction. They'll come in and say like, I just feel off, right? I just feel, and we don't feel our body when we're not in any sort of dysfunction. That's the cool and interesting thing. And what's great about sensory processing is the only thing that enters our consciousness that our brain decides is important enough is like less than 1% of what actually comes into the system. So the brain can decide, all right, well, that, it's kind of cool in here. That's not an important thing. We can, or, hey, she doesn't even have to know about this. We'll just kind of generate like a little chill response or goosebumps or whatever it is. So there are so many messages coming in and the brain is making decisions about them. And lucky for us, we don't have to know about all of them, right? And oftentimes, even if like something like you guys are sitting, and a butt cheek goes numb and you kind of shift in your chair, that can be something that you don't even really recognize. Again, unless it's loud enough, unless it hurts enough, then you may not know it's there. So the final thing is interoception, and it's another one of the senses that we didn't know how to name, but it's this ability that our internal organs communicate some need. I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, I feel queasy, I don't feel good, that sort of thing. And then the same thing, that brain gets the message and we do something about it. So take, for example, I'm thirsty. We have neural networks that form that I don't even have to think about. If I generate the sensation of thirst, I'm going to walk to my cabinet. I'm going to get a water. I'm going to get a cup. I'm going to go to the faucet, get some water and drink, right? So volitionally, my brain has to tell different muscles to activate to do that pattern, but I don't have to think about it, right? So that is sort of all of these different sensations and receptors are the ones that are attracting these different sensory experiences and telling the brain, hey, there's something going on here, right? So let's first talk about sensory processing of non-noxious stimulus. I just used the example of I'm thirsty, we get a glass of water, or I walk outside, it's a little bit cooler. So the sensory input comes in. We have sensory receptors in our tissue that respond to some threshold of stimulus that is less than what we would consider potentially dangerous. Now, that's different for every person, right? In someone who has a more robustly alert nervous system, a tapping sensation is going to be felt a little bit different, right? But let's say that in my nervous system, a tapping, so as I use the example, you've just been touched on the outside of the left leg in the skin, right? I get tapped, I'm walking, in a twig or something, taps my leg. So that's the message that comes in. The sensory receptors that are activated are the touch receptors. We don't have to know what those are. That message is carried from a peripheral nerve all the way up to the spinal cord up to the brain. And that message is a very benign, neutral, you just been touched on your skin. We don't know anything else about it. Have we been here before? Is this potentially dangerous? So I use the example of walking out the cool weather. If I'm walking and I get kind of scraped on my leg, immediately in my brain's like, nah, you walk this same path every day. It's that same twig, you don't have to do anything about it. Or let's just make sure that wasn't anything dangerous and look down, right? So the output or the response can be something so benign, right? But okay, and then messages get to the spinal cord, get to the nervous system, to the central nervous system, spinal cord and brain. And the message becomes, hey, you've just been touched on the outside of your leg. Have we been here before? Is this dangerous? Do we need to be doing something about that, right? And the brain generates some response, right? So I either need to look down, I need to rub my leg, I need to get a coat, I need to get a glass of water, all those sort of things. It can be the most benign of any response, right? But every single thing we do in our life is based in sensory processing. The way we respond to anything all goes back to this. But what happens when that sensory experience is a higher stimulus than feels safe for my body, right? And again, everyone's is different. So many factors go into what triggers the alarm system in any person. But what's interesting is if there's a tap on the outside of my leg and it's hard enough, or the scratch is hard enough, that both that sensory experience that we just mentioned, the non-noxious, that message gets carried, hey, you're touched on the outside. Another kind of bilateral system is also triggered, and that's our nociceptive system. So the sensory receptors are a little bit different in the nociceptive, or the noxious stimulus, and they are the alarm system. So when enough of a stimulus is reached, so a temperature that is too hot or too cold, a touch that is just a bit too much, or internally, we have chemoreceptors or chemical receptors. If there's just enough of that inflammatory fluid near an organ, it's going to trigger something, right? So that's what happens. So some sensory receptors activate when that threshold is met, and then we go down this different pathway. And what's interesting is both of them exist and they're happening at the same time. One travels much quicker than the other, okay? So sensory input, nociceptors in our tissue are activated. The message is carried from the periphery to our spinal cord, and the message is different. It still doesn't say something bad has happened, something painful has happened, but what it does say is something potentially dangerous is happening on the outside of your lower left leg in the skin, right? So that message again is still not saying pain, pain. It's saying something we need to actually make note of is happening here, right? So when that gets to the spinal cord carries that same message up to the brain. Something potentially dangerous is happening in the outside of the left leg in the skin. And what's interesting is that when that message from that nociceptive system hits the brain and it goes into different areas, the alarm goes off. So the first thing that activates is the amygdala. You may have heard that word before. That is essentially, if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, did you ever see that movie? It's so beautiful. But the fear guy is the amygdala, right? I mean, he is going to assume everything is a threat, danger, and he's going to elicit this massive response. Sometimes he comes back and is like, okay, that wasn't that bad. Maybe I overreacted. But that's the key, is that the first thing that happens is the amygdala is going to assume danger. Then the executive human brain comes back in and says, wait, we've been here before. Yes, that twig, hit you a little harder this time, but it's nothing to be concerned about, that sort of thing. Or it may say, that's very dangerous. That wasn't a twig. That was actually a snake bite. We're going to make this hurt really bad so that she listens, so that she does something about it, right? So that's the difference between the non-noxious stimulus sensory processing and noxious stimulus. Now, if you've ever heard of the gate theory of pain, this is the idea that because the sensory processing of stimulus that is not dangerous travels much quicker, it sort of can override the noxious and the nociceptive pathway. So this is why if I hit my shin on a coffee table, they say you rub, right? You rub a smack, right? Rub around it. And at that moment, my nervous system is just generating a very light touch, right? As a pain practitioner who is a manual therapist, meaning I put my hands on a lot of people, and that is helpful to them. So when we first started talking about pain neuroscience education, everybody was like, take your hands off of these patients. They just need education. And what we realized is No, they need the right set of hands. Maybe you don't have the right set of hands. But the important thing about that, flooding their nervous system with really gentle tactile input can help to override that system. Okay. So when it's something very dangerous or the brain recognizes something as potentially very dangerous, it's going to make you feel it. It's going to make you know it. If it's an ankle sprain, that means you better sit down, stop walking on it, wrap it, ice it, protect it, put it in a boot, whatever it is, right? So those are things, those are social constructs that we've learned over time. Okay, shit, this is how I need to handle this, right? So I gave the example. So ankle sprain, I gave that example. Back strain is sort of similar. If I go to bend down and it elicits something, I'm going to be protective. I'm going to lay. I'm going to rest. I'm going to dig a tennis ball in there. I'm going to do all the things that I know to make sure that that kind of goes away, or make sure that I can kind of calm that system back down. Okay. But in reality, pain is not just about what you feel right there in your tissue. It's not about localized tissue. What you feel in your tissue is part of a multi-system output that includes an inflammatory response. If we have tissue damage of any kind, the first is bleeding, but the second in any healing process is inflammation. So inflammation also gets a bad rap. It's there for us to come in to break down any kind of gunky stuff in the tissue and wheel it out. But the inflammation sitting in your tissue is activating chemoreceptors. And so what ends up happening is in my low back, in my lumbar paraspinals, I've got extra inflammation. Then the chemoreceptors there are triggering that alarm response, right? And that's what tends to happen. It just starts to kind of grow and gets bigger and bigger. But truly, pain is not just about inflammation in the tissue. It's not just about what's damaged in the tissue, but it's a bunch of different things. And the number one thing is that sympathetic nervous system response, that fight or flight response. This is why pain is so emotional. It is becomes even more about how stressed I am, how anxious I am, about my quality of life, all of those things. Another thing that's activated is the motor system. So we are wired with almost two different muscle systems. One is this very dominant protective system. It's all the muscles that are always tight when you go to a massage therapist or a PT. They're the ones that always have trigger points or tension or spasms. And they are activated when there's a threat. Okay. So that motor system turns on. It's there to protect us. It's also the system it's all the muscles that pull us into fetal position, right? Other aspects are the neuroendocrine system. So we release a ton of adrenaline and norepinephrine and cortisol, all of those good stress hormones to get us out of harm's way. And I believe that's all. So all of these things go into your pain experience at any given moment. And the thing that is most important to remember in this kind of first introductory discussion is that pain is just one output of the from the brain that is based around some sensory experience that the brain views as threatening, right? So it has truly nothing to do with the tissue, and it has nothing to do with how much actual danger you're in, but it has everything to do with your brain in that moment in time deciding that this is a major threat. Okay. So that's sort of a hard concept when you're sitting in front of me and you have pain and you feel it here and you're telling me, Claire, what you're telling me that it's some, construct that my brain created. That's sometimes hard to stomach, but it's very true. And the more you understand and the more we unpack in the next couple of seminars, this will become easier and easier to understand. So I think that's all we have for this one. But what I wanted to do, are we still recording? Hopefully. Yes, we're still recording. So, hi there. I am going to see if there's any questions that you guys have that I can answer while we're still recording. And then once we're done, look at me in the background too. Once we're done, we'll kind of shut this down and hopefully share this. So right off the bat, Amy, any thoughts? The nociceptive system. Mhm. Danger, danger, danger. Right. Yes. Right. And does the heating pad help? Okay. So this is the other thing that I tell patients too is, I said this when it comes to the research that's out there, not everybody fits, right? Like we can talk all kinds of smack about does e-stim work, does ice and heat work and all of that stuff. If my patient comes to me and they're like, this really helps, we're going to keep doing it. Like, and that fits into that placebo of like there's something about that experience that calms your nervous system, and that's the most important thing when you're in a pain experience and a pain threat. And what's interesting about what you're saying is, remember how I talked about this sort of activation of both of those systems at the same time, right? So if I get hit hard enough, my normal sensory processing system activates, right, and carries that message, but also that nociceptive system activates. And what's interesting about pain that doesn't fit into like the tissue and sort of what you're describing as like, okay, well, I didn't get hit by a bus today, right? And I didn't have anything major happen to me that would have triggered, right? Or like my images are like, well, you got some degenerative changes, but they're not like, whoa, you have something horrible. So the other interesting thing that's happening is that nociceptive alarm system is firing, it's misfiring, but there's no non-noxious pathway that's also being firing to like gate it, right? So because it's not something that happened in an instant and I'm getting a message from that tissue, it's almost this like, okay, now the nociceptive system is firing and the other side is not. Then you can see how like, oh, that message is coming in loud and clear and it's danger, it's alarm, it's bad, it's, all of that kind of stuff. So I would say like my first thing as a um, pain practitioner is if you have things that make you feel better, and I don't care how ridiculous they are, keep them by, use them. I would also say the other homework that I give lots of my patients is for 5 minutes a day, do something that brings you absolute joy. Because there is no other thing that calms and regulates our nervous system better than like just being in your body and fully alive in something that you love. Because in those moments, your pain is still there, but it dampens a little bit, right? And the goal is not that we're going to get rid of your pain right now. The goal is let's just show your nervous system that it is safe here, right? And like, let's dampen that response a little bit. And then that trickles down a little bit where your alarm, your nociceptive alarm is not so aggressive, right? Um, anything? Yeah, yeah. The sun. Yes. I love that. Sure. I love that. I love that. And I think there's something, and generally, it's maybe at on the fourth seminar, I do like some tips and tools of like, okay, how do we calm our nervous system? And one of them is get in nature. And it's like there's something extremely healing and powerful about the sun, about the moon, about the grass, about the birds. And it's like we've lost touch with that, right? Like we're in a phase where we're so disconnected from even that, right? Exactly. So I love that. And one of the things you said and I wanted to like make note of this, is like emotional pain, physical pain. And what I will say, this is the most interesting thing about, and it goes back to nervous system regulation, is that your brain doesn't distinguish between physical trauma and mental and emotional like trauma and stress. The same systems are activated, the same threat response is perceived. So, what I mean by that is like we can generate a physical sensation of pain just by with emotions and thoughts and stuff. And so that's really interesting that our nervous system is not distinguishing, well, like, okay, well, he's real sad right now, or he's real anxious right now. It's all coming in as a threat. And so that threat response is going to be big. You're going to get more anxious. You're going to get more fight or flight. You're going to get more reactive. We're going to get more pain. All of those things are kind of like they play off of each other, right? So, yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. Ooh, I feel that. I feel that deeply. So, this is as a side note. No one has to buy my book, but I'm writing a book, and the first words of the book is I think we need to rethink sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, because I feel exactly the same way. When it comes to physical pain and trauma, it's like I understand it. I'm not afraid of it. The thought of going back to a place of anxiety that I was as a child, or like it is almost, it was almost unmanageable. I mean, it just is so, and so that's the unique, that's the uniqueness of pain. And that's something that we'll talk about when we talk about different key concepts in pain science. And one of them is pain is unique to every single person. And it's generated based on everything you've experienced in your life, good, bad, or ugly. It's part of what we're handed down from our ancestors and our genes, and like, you know, just trauma, right? Like trauma that's been rooted in our genetic code at this point, right? And there's actually a great book. It's called It Didn't Start With You. Mark, now I'm forgetting the last name, but it's a beautiful book, and it's about that. It's like inherited family trauma, right? And so all of those things and my belief systems about pain, the way my parents communicated about pain, my religious affiliation and how they view pain, the fact that you're a male and men are not supposed to have pain and not supposed to cry, so it's all these social constructs that we've heard over time that become in that moment how our nervous system responds to whatever threats, right? And I use this example too, and I may have it later in other seminars, but like, why do some soldiers come home and can assimilate back into their lives, to their marriages, without problem? And then you have some that have have such PTSD, they are dissociated out of their body, they cannot cope, they cannot recover. And the differences between these two individuals is in the moment of impact, the moment of, wow, this is a really stressful event or experience, is that one was in a place where their nervous system was a little bit more safe and regulated. And they could view this as, wow, this is a really, really terrible situation. Hi, come on in. Oh, hey. Like one can say, boy, this is really horrible, right? But it doesn't encode in their body as a dysregulated trauma. The others are reactive, their nervous systems are already ramped up. And when they experience that negative event, they can't cope, right? And so I think of that all the time. And that is how we navigate our pain, our world, it's how we experience different things at different times. It's why, like, if I'm in a tiff with my with my spouse and I like hit arm on the door, doesn't it feel like so much worse when you're like pissed? Like, right? You know, it's like, okay, that might not have hurt before, but because I'm all ramped up, now I'm really activated, right? Now everything's an alarm, everything's and so it's interesting. It's in whatever moment in time is how you're going to be able to kind of cope and walk away from that. And to you, the social constructs and your history and everything you've learned, we don't have to be afraid of the physical pain, the broken leg, we can fix that, right? We can brace that. It'll be fine. It's those other deeper things that, are more meaningful. Yeah, sure.
Um, I have a theory on why one culture would be different than
Okay.
children. Or let's say as parents,
Hmm.
we're supposed to allow our children to experience failures,
Yes.
responsibility,
Yes.
and but protect them at the same time.
Amen. 100%.
But I mean,
Yep.
we already
Absolutely. And trusts themselves in that moment, right? And there's a book called The Blessing of the Skin Knee. Have you ever heard that? And it's basically a parenting book of like, let your kids get hurt. Let them off leash a little bit. Let them feel bored. Let them feel pain. Let them, and I would say to build off of what you said, and if you couldn't hear, he was talking about sort of a theory of like why one soldier might have one experience, the same experience, but in a different way. And he thought that sort of your upbringing and what you were taught pain meant, and that you could handle pain and deal with it and be okay. So maybe your parents allowed you to experience some of those really negative things. I would even say that the far ends of the spectrum of like parents who were neglectful and almost maybe even abusive, and then the parents that over helicoptered, that did not allow that child to develop their own. So now you've got a high traumatized ACEs score. That nervous system is ramped up. And then you have this one over here that has no ability to cope whatsoever, right? So I would even like build off of your theory as like, there's a sweet spot of like people who were taught, you know?
theory goes a little bit further, but I didn't want to drag on.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
A parent or somebody that
Yeah.
I would
Yeah. Sure. I- That's excellent. Are you a parent? Because you should be. That's really powerful. I mean, I wish parents communicated words like this. Yes. Yes. Oh, it was 7:30 this morning. You guys will love this. We had someone come in. She was supposed to be here for a meeting at 7:30 a.m. But don't leave because I want to talk to you, because if you're someone who wants to be at a meeting like that, then you're definitely meant to be here as well. Of December 7th. Oh, of this one. Oh yeah. Well, there was a trauma conference meeting this morning. That's so funny. All right, guys, I am going to stop our recording, and then that way we can kind of chit chat in person. But thank you so much for watching and tuning in. And please come to any of the next three pain seminars. every Friday in November, except for the day after Thanksgiving. We're going to skip that week and do the first Friday of December. You don't have to have attended the first one to come to the second or third or fourth. We'd love to have you, or you can tune in virtually. So thanks so much.